Help me, they're coming.
Please, listen to me.
That was the first thing he said, and I remember thinking how wrong it sounded coming from a man like him, because men like him weren't supposed to beg, they were supposed to be the reason other people did, and yet there he was, standing just inside the flickering neon glow of Rose's diner at 2:17 a.m., soaked from the cold drizzle outside, his breath uneven, his voice low but urgent like something was breaking underneath it. And I froze with a coffee pot still in my hand, halfway through, refilling a cup that had already gone cold 10 minutes ago, because everything about him felt out of place, not just the way he looked, tall, sharp, dressed in a dark suit that didn't belong in a place that served pancakes for $5.99, but the way the air shifted when he walked in, like the room itself noticed him, like something unseen had followed him through that door and was now waiting just outside, patient, silent, watching. And I remember my first instinct wasn't to help, it was to step back. To put distance between me and whatever trouble he carried with him, because I had rules, simple ones, the kind that kept people like me safe in a city that didn't care if you disappeared, rules like don't get involved, don't ask questions, don't make eye contact with problems dressed in expensive clothes, but he looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned against him, and his hand gripped the edge of the counter just enough for me to notice the tension. There, not weakness, not exactly, but something close to it, something controlled, like he was holding himself together by force of will alone, and I could hear it then, faint at first, the distant hum of engines slowing somewhere outside, tires on wet pavement, doors opening and closing too quietly to be casual, and my heartbeat picked up without permission because I knew that sound, not from experience but from instinct, the kind you don't question, the kind that tells you when to leave before something goes wrong, and yet I didn't move. Not right away, because his eyes held mine, dark and steady and far too aware, like he was measuring me, like he already knew I wouldn't walk away, and maybe that's what scared me most, not the men outside, not the tension in the air, but the certainty in his voice when he said it again, softer this time, closer, help me, like it wasn't a request but a turning point, like whatever I did next would change something permanent, and I swallowed, my throat dry, my fingers tightening around the coffee pot as if that could anchor me. As if that could make this just another late night shift with bad tips and tired customers, but nothing about this felt normal, not the way the neon light buzzed overhead, not the way the clock ticked louder than it should have, not the way the world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and I thought about calling 911, about stepping back and letting someone else handle it, someone trained, someone who didn't have rent due next week and a life built on staying invisible, but something stopped me, something small and stubborn and impossible to ignore, because the way he stood there, despite everything, despite the urgency in his voice, despite the fact that whoever was coming clearly wasn't someone you wanted to meet, he didn't look afraid in the way most people would be, he looked focused, like he had already accepted the worst and was simply choosing his next move, and for a second, just one, I saw past the danger, past the suit, past the weight of whatever power he carried, and I saw a man who needed help and hated that he needed it, and that's when the sound outside got closer, clearer, footsteps now, deliberate, unhurried, and I knew I was out of time, that whatever decision I was going to make had to happen now, not later, not after thinking it through, and I should have walked away, I should have told him to leave, I should have chosen the version of my life that stayed simple and safe, but instead I set the coffee pot down, looked him straight in the eye, and did the one thing I knew I would regret, the one thing no one in their right mind would have done. I stepped forward instead of back. I moved before I could think, my body deciding something my mind had not caught up to yet, stepping around the counter and closing the distance between us until I could see the fine details that made him even more unsettling up close, the sharp line of his jaw, the controlled way he held his shoulders despite the strain beneath it, the kind of presence that did not disappear just because the situation had turned against him, and for a second I almost stopped, almost stepped back again, but the sound outside pushed me forward, closer now, voices low and coordinated, not loud, not chaotic, which somehow made it worse, because it meant they knew exactly what they were doing, and he followed my movement with his eyes, tracking me like I was already part of whatever plan he had not said out loud, and that realization sent a quiet chill through me because I did not have a plan, I barely had a decision, just a stubborn refusal to let whatever was about to happen unfold right in front of me, so I grabbed his sleeve without asking, my fingers brushing fabric that felt far too expensive for this place, and I pulled him toward the narrow hallway. behind the counter where employees kept extra supplies and tried to ignore how wrong this felt, how dangerous it was to touch someone like him like he was just another customer who needed directions. But he did not resist, which surprised me more than anything. He moved when I moved, steady despite the tension in his frame, and that told me everything I needed to know. Whatever power he carried out there did not follow him in here, not right now, not in this moment, and that meant we had very little time. I pushed open the storage door and guided him inside, the small space smelling faintly of cleaning supplies and old cardboard, the light overhead flickering once before settling into a dim glow, and I let go of his sleeve only long enough to grab a stack of aprons hanging on a hook, my hands moving faster than my thoughts, because stopping meant second guessing, and second guessing meant freezing, and freezing was not an option anymore. Not with footsteps approaching the front door. Not with the bell above it about to ring, and I turned back to him, holding out the apron like it was the most normal thing in the world, like I did this every night, hid strangers from trouble while refilling coffee. And for the first time since he walked in, something shifted in his expression, not confusion exactly, more like calculation adjusting to something unexpected, and I heard the faintest exhale from him, almost a quiet acknowledgement, before he took the apron from my hand, his fingers brushing mine for just a second, warm and steady, grounding in a way that made no sense, and I shook it off immediately because there was no time for that. No time to process anything beyond the next few seconds. I pointed to the back exit and whispered, "You stay here until I tell you to move, do not make a sound," my voice lower than I expected, steadier too, like I had already committed to this path whether I liked it or not, and his eyes locked onto mine again, sharp and searching, as if he was deciding whether to trust me or override me, and for a brief second I thought he might argue, might take control the way men like him usually did, but instead he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and that was it. No questions, no hesitation, just agreement, which somehow felt heavier than any command, and right then the bell above the diner door rang, clear and bright and completely out of place against the tension that flooded the room, and I stepped back into the main area just as the door swung open, forcing my expression into something normal, something tired and unimpressed, because that was what they expected to see. Not someone who had just hidden a man they were clearly looking for. And as I reached for the coffee pot again, my hands only trembling slightly now, I realized I had already crossed the line I was never supposed to cross, and there was no going back. I kept my back straight and my movement slow as I poured coffee into a cup that did not need it, the steady stream giving me something to focus on while the door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. 3 men stepping inside like they belonged anywhere they chose to be, their presence quiet but deliberate, the kind of quiet that made everything else feel unnecessary. And I did not look at them right away because people like that noticed everything. Especially fear, so I set the pot down, wiped my hands on a towel, and turned with the same tired expression I had worn all night, the kind that said I had seen worse customers and did not care enough to remember their faces. But the second my eyes met theirs, I knew that was not going to work, because they were not here for coffee or shelter from the rain, they were here for him, and the way their gaze moved across the diner, scanning corners, measuring distances, made it clear they expected to find what they were looking for. One of them stepped forward, not aggressive, not loud, just certain, his voice calm in a way that made my stomach tighten, asking if I had seen anyone come in recently, and I shrugged before he even finished the question, leaning one hip against the counter like this was routine, like I answered questions from strangers at 2 in the morning all the time, and I told him no, just a couple of regulars earlier, nothing worth remembering, my voice steady enough that it surprised even me, and he watched me for a second longer than necessary, his eyes searching my face for something that would give me away, something I refused to let surface, because if I broke now, if I hesitated even for a second, everything I had just done would collapse, and I could feel the weight of that decision pressing down on me, heavier than anything I had carried before, the awareness that I was not just lying, I was choosing a side, even if I did not fully understand what that side meant yet. And behind me, down that narrow hallway, a man who did not belong in places like this was trusting me to keep him invisible, which felt like the most dangerous responsibility I had ever taken on. The silence stretched just long enough to make my pulse loud in my ears, and then another one of them moved past the first, glancing toward the booths, toward the restrooms, toward the back hallway for just a fraction of a second too long. And I stepped forward before I could think better of it, grabbing a menu and holding it out like it mattered, like it was the most important thing in the world right now, asking if they wanted anything to eat, my tone just Shy of impatient, because sometimes people expected attitude more than compliance, and it threw them off balance, and for a moment it worked, just enough to shift their attention back to me, to make me the focus instead of the space behind me, and I kept talking, listing off specials that had been sitting under heat lamps for too long, describing pancakes and eggs like I cared, like this was just another slow night with customers who would leave without tipping. And I saw it then, the smallest exchange of glances between them, not uncertainty, but reconsideration, like maybe this was not the place they thought it was, like maybe the man they were looking for would not end up in a place that smelled like burnt coffee and cheap syrup. And that was the moment I realized what I was doing, not just hiding him, but rewriting the story in front of them, giving them something ordinary to hold onto so they would not look deeper. And one of them finally shook his head slightly, muttering something about checking somewhere else, and they turned toward the door again, not rushing, not careless, just moving on, and I did not breathe until the bell rang a second time and the door closed behind them, the sound echoing through the empty diner like a release I did not trust yet, because I knew this was not over, not even close, and for a second I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again, waiting for this to fall apart. But it stayed closed, the rain still tapping softly against the windows, the neon light still flickering overhead, and only then did I turn toward the hallway, my heart still racing, knowing that whatever came next was going to be even harder than what I had just done. I did not rush back there right away, even though every part of me wanted to, because rushing meant panic and panic made mistakes, so I forced myself to move like nothing had changed, wiping down the counter, straightening a stack of napkins that did not need straightening, listening to the sound of the rain against the windows and the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the kitchen wall, waiting for any sign that they had turned around, that the door would open again. That this moment of quiet was just a pause before everything collapsed, but the second stretched into something steadier, something real, and only then did I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my shoulders loosening just enough for me to feel how tense they had been, and I turned toward the hallway, each step slower than it should have been, because part of me was still trying to understand what I had just done. How I had stood there and lied without hesitation, how I had protected someone I did not know, someone who clearly lived in a world far removed from mine, and yet none of that changed the fact that he was still back there, waiting, trusting me to come back, and that thought pulled me forward more than anything else. I pushed open the storage door carefully, the hinge creaking just enough to make me wince, and for a second I saw nothing but shadows and shelves, the dim light casting everything in soft grey shapes. And then he stepped forward from the corner, quiet and controlled, like he had been standing there the entire time without moving, without making a sound, and I felt that same shift again, that awareness of him filling the small space in a way that did not belong in a supply room with cardboard boxes and cleaning products, and our eyes met, and something unspoken passed between us, not relief exactly, but acknowledgement. Like we both understood that something had just happened that could not be undone. They left, I said, my voice lower than I intended, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile calm had settled over the moment, and he studied me for a second, searching my face the same way those men had, but for a different reason, like he was trying to understand why I had done it, why I had chosen this instead of the easier path, and I could not answer that even if he asked, because I did not fully understand it myself. I just knew that walking away had not been an option, not when he had looked at me like that, not when the choice had been placed directly in front of me, and he nodded once, a small movement that carried more weight than it should have, and then he reached up, adjusting the apron I had handed him earlier, the white fabric stark against the dark lines of his suit, and the contrast was almost absurd, like he was wearing a disguise that did not quite fit but worked just enough to blur the edges, and I almost laughed at the sight, almost, but the seriousness of the situation held it back, keeping everything balanced on that thin line between normal and something far more dangerous. You should go, I said, glancing toward the back exit, the words coming out automatically because that was the logical next step, the safe one, the one that would put distance between me and whatever world he came from. But even as I said it, I knew it was not that simple, not anymore, because the look in his eyes shifted slightly, something sharper, more focused, and he took a step closer, closing the space between us in a way that made my breath catch for just a second, not out of fear, not entirely, but because of the intensity behind it, the kind that made it clear. He was not just reacting to what had happened, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, already calculating what came next, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, controlled, but no longer strained. They will be back, he said, not as a warning, not as a guess, but as a certainty, and the weight of that settled over me instantly, heavier than anything that had come before, because it meant this was not over, not even close. It meant the line I had crossed was not behind me, it was just the beginning, and for the first time since he walked in, I felt something close to doubt creep in, a small voice asking if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life, and I swallowed it down before it could take hold, because it was too late for that now, too late to go back to the version of myself who would have stayed out of it, and I met his gaze, steady despite the uncertainty building underneath, and said the only thing that made sense in that moment. Then we make sure they do not find you. I did not expect him to agree so easily, not after the way he carried himself, not after the quiet authority in every movement he made, but he did not argue, did not question me, he just watched me for a second like he was recalibrating something in his head, like the situation had shifted in a way he had not predicted, and then he gave a small nod that felt less like surrender and more like a decision, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to, because it meant he was choosing to follow my lead, at least for now, and that put a weight on my shoulders I was not prepared for. I turned away before I could overthink it, stepping back into the hallway and motioning for him to follow, my mind already racing through what little I knew about this place, about the exits, about the blind spots, about the things people did not notice when they were not looking for them, which was most of the time, and I kept my voice low as I spoke. There is a back alley, but it is too open. If they circle around they will see you the second you step out. I pushed through the kitchen door, the smell of grease and old coffee grounding me in something familiar, something simple, even as everything else felt anything but, and I grabbed a second apron, a worn baseball cap from the lost and found box, and handed both to him without hesitation. Put these on, you do not look like someone who belongs here. The words slipped out before I could soften them, but he did not seem offended. If anything, there was a flicker of something almost amused in his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, and he took the cap, pulling it down just enough to shadow his face, the transformation not perfect, not even close, but enough to shift the first impression, enough to make someone glance past him instead of at him, and that was all we needed, just a moment of doubt, a second of hesitation. I moved toward the back door but stopped just short of opening it, listening again, always listening now, because silence could mean safety or it could mean the opposite, and I was starting to understand that the difference mattered. I looked back at him, really looked this time, taking in the way he stood despite everything, steady, controlled, like the world had tried to knock him off balance, and he had refused to fall, and it made me wonder what kind of life shaped someone into that, what kind of choices led to men in dark suits searching for him in the middle of the night. But I pushed that thought aside because it was not useful right now. Curiosity was a luxury I could not afford. When we go out there, you follow my pace, do not look around, do not hesitate, I said, my voice firm in a way that surprised me, like I had done this before even though I had not, and he held my gaze for a second longer before responding, his voice quieter now, but stronger than before. You are not afraid. It was not a question, more like an observation, and I almost laughed at that, because I was afraid, more than I had ever been, but fear did not always stop you. Sometimes it just sharpened everything, made the world clearer, more immediate. I admitted, reaching for the door handle, my fingers steady despite the truth of it. I just do not have time to be, and that seemed to settle something between us, something unspoken but understood, and for a brief second the tension shifted, not gone, but different, like we were no longer two strangers caught in the same moment, but two people moving toward the same outcome. And that thought hit me harder than anything else, because it meant I had already stepped further into his world than I ever intended. I pushed the door open just enough to peek outside. The alley stretching empty under a flickering streetlight, rain still falling in a steady rhythm, and I exhaled slowly, stepping out first without waiting to see if he followed, because at this point there was no turning back, only forward, and whatever came next was already set in motion the second I chose not to walk away. I stepped into the alley and felt the cold air hit my face like a reset I did not ask for, the rain lighter now but steady enough to blur the edges of everything, turning the world into something softer and more uncertain, and I kept walking without looking back, trusting that he was behind me because stopping to check would break the rhythm we needed, the narrow space stretching ahead with dumpsters lining one side and a chain link fence on the other, the kind of place people passed through quickly without thinking, which was exactly why it could work if we moved like we belonged there, if we did not hesitate, if we did not give anyone a reason to look twice, and I focused on my steps, even, unhurried, like I had done this 100 times before, like this was just another shortcut home after a long shift, but every sound felt louder than it should have. Every drip of water, every distant car, every shift of gravel under my shoes, and I knew he heard it too because his presence behind me was steady, controlled, matching my pace exactly, not crowding me, not falling behind, just there, and that strange sense of awareness settled in again, that I was not alone in this, that whatever happened next, we were already moving through it together whether I liked it or not. We reached the corner where the alley split. One path leading toward the main street with more light and more people, the other darker, quieter, leading deeper between buildings where shadows held longer and sounds carried less, and I slowed just enough to make it look natural, like I was deciding between two familiar routes, even though I was calculating risk in real time, weighing visibility against exposure, and I chose the darker path because fewer people meant fewer eyes, fewer chances for someone to recognize him, even if it also meant fewer chances to disappear into a crowd. And I turned without a word, trusting him to follow. The ground uneven beneath us, the faint hum of a distant generator filling the silence, and for a moment it almost felt manageable, like we might actually get away with this, like the world might let us slip through unnoticed. But that feeling did not last, because as we moved further in, I caught the reflection of headlights sweeping across the far end of the alley, slow, deliberate, not passing by but searching. And my chest tightened instantly, the realization hitting before I could stop it. They were not gone. They were adapting, adjusting, just like he had said they would, and I did not stop walking, did not turn around, but my voice dropped low enough that only he could hear it. "Do not look at them," I said, the words barely more than breath, because looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant drawing attention, and I could feel the tension behind me shift slightly, not fear, never that, but awareness sharpening, focus narrowing, and I adjusted my pace just enough to seem casual, just enough to avoid looking like we were trying to escape, because running would end this faster than anything else, and we needed time. Just a little more time. We reached a metal service door halfway down the wall, one I had noticed months ago and never thought twice about until now, and I stopped there like it was intentional, like this had always been the plan, reaching into my apron pocket where I kept random things from shifts that blurred together, receipts, spare change, a small key I had found weeks ago and never returned because I did not know where it belonged, and I pulled it out with a quiet breath. Not even sure if it would work, but knowing I had to try, I slid it into the lock and turned it slowly, the mechanism catching for a second that felt too long before finally giving with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, and I pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, stepping into darkness that smelled faintly of dust and old air, and I did not wait for him to question it, did not give him time to reconsider, I just moved forward and trusted he would follow again. Because at this point trust was not a choice, it was the only thing holding this together, and as the door closed behind us, shutting out the narrow beam of headlights that swept past a second later, I realized something I had not wanted to admit until now. This was no longer about helping a stranger, this was about surviving a situation I had already stepped too far into to walk away from. The darkness inside swallowed us faster than I expected, the door clicking shut behind us like a final decision I could not undo, and for a second I could not see anything at all, just the faint outline of shapes forming slowly as my eyes adjusted, the air cooler here, still, carrying that quiet weight of a place people forgot existed, and I stood there listening, my hand still on the door as if I might need to open it again at any second, but the sound outside moved past us, the faint sweep of tires fading just enough to loosen the tight grip in my chest, not gone, never gone, just quieter, and I exhaled slowly, stepping forward into the space, my shoes echoing softly against concrete that felt older than the diner, older than this entire block, and I realized this was not just a storage area, not just some forgotten room, it stretched deeper than that, service corridor maybe, something built for movement behind the scenes, hidden from anyone who did not know it existed, and that thought grounded me in a strange way, because hidden was exactly what we needed right now. I reached along the wall until my fingers brushed against a switch and I flipped it, the light flickering to life in a dim yellow glow that revealed narrow walls, pipes running along the ceiling, and a long path stretching ahead with doors spaced out at uneven intervals, and I turned slightly, checking that he was still there, and of course he was, exactly where I expected, standing just inside the light, his expression calmer now, more controlled, like whatever urgency had driven him into the diner had shifted into something colder, more precise, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence settling between us in a way that felt heavier now that we were out of immediate danger, because now there was space to think. And thinking brought questions I was not sure I wanted answers to, but he broke the silence first, his voice low but steady. "You know this place?" And I shook my head slightly, because knowing was not the right word. I had noticed it, remembered it, the way you remember small details that seem useless until suddenly they are not. "I pay attention," I said simply, because that was the truth, and something in his gaze shifted at that. Like he understood exactly what I meant without needing more explanation, and then he stepped closer, not invading, not overwhelming, just enough to close the distance so his voice did not carry beyond us. "You should not be here," he said, not as an insult, not as judgment, but as a fact, like he was stating something inevitable, and I let out a quiet breath, leaning back against the wall for just a second, feeling the cool surface steady me. "I was not supposed to be," I replied, meeting his eyes again, because avoiding them felt pointless now, "but neither were you," and that earned the smallest reaction from him. Not quite a smile, but something close. Something that did not reach his eyes but softened the edge of the moment just enough to remind me he was still human under all of this, and that realization caught me off guard more than anything else, because it was easier to think of him as something distant, something dangerous and separate from my world. But standing here, in this narrow space, with the noise of the city muted behind walls and distance, he felt closer to something real, something I could not categorize as easily as I wanted to, and I pushed away from the wall, straightening slightly, because staying still too long made everything feel heavier, more complicated, and we did not have time for that, not with the possibility of those men doubling back, not with the uncertainty of how far this place stretched. "We cannot stay here," I said, my voice firm again, pulling us back into motion, because movement meant control, meant choice, and standing still meant waiting for something else to decide for us, and I gestured down the corridor, the dim light stretching ahead like a path we had not chosen but now had to follow, and for a brief second I hesitated, just enough to feel the weight of what came next, because every step forward meant going deeper into something I did not understand, something I could not predict, but turning back was no longer an option, not after everything that had already happened, and I started walking again without waiting for him to respond, trusting that he would follow like he had before, because at this point, whether either of us admitted it or not, we were already tied to the same outcome, and whatever waited at the end of this corridor, we were going to face it together. The corridor stretched longer than it should have, the kind of space that made time feel uneven, like every step forward carried more weight than the last, and I kept my pace steady even though my mind was starting to catch up with everything that had already happened, replaying it in pieces that did not quite fit together yet. The diner, the men, the way he had looked at me like I was the only option left, and now this narrow path pulling us deeper into something I had never planned to be part of, and I told myself to focus, to stay present, because thinking too far ahead would only slow me down, and slowing down was not something we could afford, not now. Not when we still did not know how far this place went or where it would lead us, the dim lights above flickering every few steps, casting shadows that shifted along the walls like they were moving with us, and I kept my eyes forward, scanning, counting doors, noting details the way I always did without realizing it, a habit that suddenly felt like the only reason we were still ahead of whatever was chasing us. And behind me, his presence remained constant, controlled, like he was conserving energy, waiting for the moment when he would need it most, and that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because it reminded me again that this was not just any man, this was someone used to situations like this, someone who understood danger in a way I did not, and yet here he was, following me through a corridor he had never seen before, trusting instincts that were not his own. And that shift in control felt fragile, temporary, like something that could snap back at any second, and I was not sure what would happen when it did. We passed another door, slightly open this time, and I slowed just enough to glance inside, a small room filled with stacked crates and old equipment, nothing useful, nothing that would help us right now, so I kept moving, pushing past it without hesitation, because stopping meant losing momentum, and momentum was the only thing keeping us ahead. And then I heard it, faint at first, a sound that did not belong to this space, a distant echo carried through the corridor, not loud, not obvious, but there, steady and deliberate, and my chest tightened instantly, because I recognized that pattern now, that quiet persistence, the way it did not rush, did not panic, just moved forward with purpose, and I did not need to turn around to know what it meant. They had found another way in, they were closer than I had hoped, and I slowed just enough to speak without raising my voice. They are inside, the words settling between us like something inevitable, and for the first time since we entered this place, I felt his presence shift behind me, not in fear, never that, but in readiness, like a switch had been flipped, like he had been waiting for this moment, and I realized then that I had been leading us through uncertainty, but he had been preparing for the certainty that would follow, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped, the path splitting again, one direction leading toward a faint glow of light, the other darker, narrower, almost hidden, and I hesitated just long enough to feel the pressure of the decision building, because this one felt different, heavier, like it would determine everything that came next, and I glanced back at him for the first time since we started moving, meeting his eyes in the dim light, and there was something there now that had not been before, something steadier, something that told me he was no longer just following, he was ready to take control if needed, and for a second I considered stepping back, letting him decide, letting him lead, because this was his world, not mine, but something inside me resisted that, something that had already carried me this far and was not ready to let go yet, and I turned back toward the darker path, choosing it not because it felt safer, but because it felt less predictable, and unpredictability was the only advantage we had left, and as I stepped forward again, I felt it clearly for the first time, this was no longer about escaping. This was about outthinking something that did not make mistakes, and I was not sure how long I could keep doing that, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty, I was not walking away now. The darker path closed in around us almost immediately, the walls narrowing just enough to make every step feel more deliberate, more committed, and I kept moving even as the sound behind us grew clearer, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but real in a way that pressed against my senses, reminding me that whatever advantage we had was slipping, inch by inch, and I forced myself not to look back, not to measure the distance we had left, because that would only slow me down, and slowing down was not something we could survive right now. The air here felt heavier, quieter, like the corridor itself was holding its breath, and I could feel his presence closer now, not because he was crowding me, but because the space demanded it, the margin between us shrinking with every step, and that awareness sharpened everything, every sound, every shift of light, every decision, until it felt like the world had narrowed to just this path and the choices we made inside it, and then it happened, a faint echo ahead this time, not behind. A sound that did not belong to empty space, something subtle but unmistakable, and I slowed instinctively, my mind racing through possibilities, because that should not have been there, not if this path was truly empty, not if we were alone in it, and I stopped just short of the next turn, my hand brushing against the wall to steady myself, and for the first time since we entered this place, I did look back, meeting his eyes in the dim light, and I did not need to explain what I had heard, because he had heard it too. I could see it in the way his expression shifted, not fear. Never that, but calculation tightening, adjusting, and in that moment something changed between us, something unspoken but undeniable, the dynamic shifting from me leading and him following to something more balanced, more shared, because this was no longer about instinct alone, this was about understanding the kind of situation we were in, and he stepped forward slightly, just enough to close the gap completely. His voice low but certain when he spoke, "We are not alone down here," and the calm in his tone settled something inside me, not because it made things easier, but because it made them clearer, and clarity was what we needed now more than anything. I nodded once, my mind already moving, already adjusting, because if there were people ahead and behind, then the path forward was not escape, it was strategy, it was choosing how to move through something that was closing in, and I took a breath, steadying myself, feeling that familiar tension settle into focus instead of panic, because panic would end this faster than anything else, and I turned slightly, scanning the wall beside us until I found it, a narrow metal ladder partially hidden behind a panel that looked like it had not been used in years, something I might have missed if I had not been paying attention the way I always did, and I reached for it without hesitation, pulling the panel aside just enough to reveal the space behind it, a vertical shaft leading upward into darkness, and I glanced at him again, meeting his eyes with a certainty I did not question this time. "Up is better than forward," I said quietly, because forward meant walking into something we could not see, and up meant changing the game entirely, and for a second he studied me, not doubting, not questioning, just assessing, and then he gave a single nod, the same way he had before, the same quiet agreement that carried more weight than words, and that was enough. I grabbed the ladder and started climbing without waiting, my hand steady despite everything, the metal cold under my fingers, each step pulling me further away from the path below, further away from the sounds that were growing closer, and I did not look down, did not check if he was following, because I already knew he would, because at this point we were not choosing separately anymore. We were moving as one, driven by the same need to stay ahead of something that refused to stop, and as the darkness above began to shift into a faint hint of light, I realized something that should have terrified me but did not. This was no longer about escaping one moment of danger, this was about stepping into something larger, something that would not end when we reached the top of this ladder, and for the first time since this began, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. I had not just saved him tonight, I had tied my future to his, whether I was ready for it or not.